So when you say you're looking at the genetics of a tree,
Yeah.
what exactly does that mean?
And if it came from a tree that large, it still thinks it's 60 years old.
Oh my goodness. Hi everyone, my name's Emily February. I'm also known as Ranger M. I'm an environmental communicator and educator, and I get to talk to a lot of different people about all things nature and conservation. I love to knowledge share, and that's what I want to do with you. So come on, let's go learn with Ranger M. Today I'm at the Southern Ontario Butternut Seed Orchard, and I'm going to speak with Megan Clay from the Forest Gene Conservation Association and Rob Davies from the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, and we're going to chat all about forest genetics, the butternut tree, which is actually an endangered species protected under the Ontario Endangered Species Act, and how these organizations are helping these species against pests, different things that are affecting them, and even climate change. So let's go catch up with Megan and Rob. Thanks for joining us today, Megan. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
So my name is Megan Clay. I'm a seed and climate change technician with the Forest Gene Conservation Association, or FGCA for short. I work on the seed management expertise and climate change adaptation program areas at FGCA. But prior to my role here, I worked for conservation authorities, a few different ones, on tree planting and restoration programs and forest management plans.
Can you tell us a bit more about what exactly the Forest Gene Conservation Association is?
Forest Gene Conservation Association, or we like to shorten it to FGCA just to keep things a little bit more simple, but we're a not-for-profit organization, and we have a unique focus on gene conservation of woody plant species in the province. We were formed in 1994. We're a not-for-profit organization, and we have a board of directors that help us with our forest strategies, and we're a membership-based organization.
Oh, very fun.
We have 4 main strategies or kind of program areas, and that's species conservation, seed management expertise, climate change adaptation, and education and advocacy.
So if we kind of like dove into each one of those ones, and the first one you mentioned was
Species recovery.
species recovery.
Yeah.
Does that mean that you are trying to bring back species that maybe have gone extinct or something, or preventing that kind of thing?
Yeah, so it's mostly working with species that are either endangered or threatened, and this can be for a number of different reasons. So behind us here right now, we're in a butternut archive site, and butternut is one of the species that's included in our species recovery program. When there's some type of an impact, whether it's a pest or disease, or sometimes it's human related, so habitat loss, some species do need a little bit of help to maintain that genetic integrity across the landscape, or just their presence in general. So again, we always go kind of back to our roots of that gene conservation, so looking for high quality individuals to include in a program. We've been working with butternut for over 20 years now, but we are branching out to other species, including black ash, and then there's some other species that are kind of on the radar in the fringes, like American beech or hemlock, that we're kind of keeping an eye on, looking at other research to see if there's ways that we can get involved. Species recovery is a really big program, or it's a really big investment. There's a lot that goes into it to do it properly. So it's not something that as a small organization we're able to do something on this scale for every single species that's in trouble, but we do have based on priorities, we'll look at particular species to work with in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. So when you say you're looking at the genetics of a tree, what exactly does that mean for tree? You know, you learn about genetics in school, but like yourself and your family and stuff. Like, what does that mean for the tree?
With genetics, for trees and plant species, woody plant species, for the most part, it's not something that you can readily see. So you can see physical characteristics of a tree, and they could be, good form, good growth, good vigor. So some good characteristics you're looking for. And that can give you an idea of the genetic quality that you're working with, but that's only a part of the picture. So genetic quality does require, for most species, and disclaimer, there's lots of variability among species, but you need lots of individuals contributing their genes to make sure that you have a healthy population.
Okay.
So often when we have endangered species and they've been reduced to a couple individuals across the landscape, there isn't a lot of those individuals contributing their genetics. And you can have something like inbreeding, or you can have a lot of recessive genes that might come out. For butternut, for example, or for some other species that are similar, we're looking for some of that tolerance or that resistance to a disease too. So that's another layer to the genetic piece, because that is something that is based on genetics.
You also mentioned seed, and seed migration is a very important part of what you're doing as well. Can you say a bit more on that?
With our seed programs and our seed management expertise programs, there's a couple different layers to how we work with folks. So at FGCA, we work with partners, conservation authorities, municipalities, different layers of government, academia, research, and Crown Forest managers. Those are the types of folks that we work with. And with our seed management programs, we can either look at recommendations for using high quality, source identified, genetically appropriate seed. Or alternatively, it's providing some guidance and support for best practices for seed collection. So we actually run and operate a certified seed collector course.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
So with that, we just want to make sure those principles of best practices for seed collection are being followed. Source documentation is really important, because looking at an individual tree, you wouldn't know where it came from, right? They're not able to talk to us and tell us, oh, I'm from London. So having that trail of information about where it came from really helps us with where we can use it.
So these trees that are behind us, where exactly are they all from this area? Like, did the original seeds and stuff come from?
They're from all over Southern Ontario.
Wow.
I should say we are in the Southern Ontario Butternut Seed Orchard. So it's one of 6 different archives that the FGCA and really great partners that we have worked to establish. So with the trees that are included in these archives, we've found punitively tolerant, so trees that we found across the landscape that appear to be either resistant to the canker. So there's a canker that impacts butternut, and that's causing the decline of the species, or part of the reason of the decline.
Right.
So we find these trees all across Southern Ontario. The orchard has been established over a series of years. It's not just a one-time planting, but from all across Southern Ontario, we found these individuals. And then there's a whole process to how we would graft them and how they came to be too. So.
Well, Megan, I would think it would be really cool if we can go and look at the different stages of these trees and maybe even ID a butternut tree.
So we can see that there is variability in some of the sizes of the trees that are within the archive, and a couple different reasons for that. Some of them are established at different times. So for example, this tree here was established in 2019, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the age of the tree.
What does that mean?
So with these, we call them grafts or clones. There's a couple of different names that are associated with these individual guys, but with this program, we want to make sure that we are capturing the specific genetic makeup of those trees that we're finding in the landscape.
Okay.
So if we were just to collect seed from a mother tree, we actually only know half of its genetic makeup, because we don't really know what the father genetic makeup would have been. So we're just working on half of the genetics. If we do something called cloning or grafting, we are capturing exactly that genetic makeup of that specific tree we found on the landscape. And we found that landscape, we've picked it for a reason, so it has specific characteristics that we're looking for. So we're usually looking for a pure butternut. So there are hybrids out on the landscape that we wouldn't want to include in a program like this. But then there's also the level of resistance or tolerance to that canker. So we found a good specimen that we want to include, and then what we actually do is take cuttings of that material. So with arborists or folks that can reach the tops of the tree, we cut small twig or branch samples from the actual tree. We do this when it's dormant or when it's kind of sleeping in the winter. So usually in March or February, we go up, we collect all these scions. Then we take that to our grafting center in Eastern Ontario, and they get grafted. So they get married onto a piece of black walnut rootstock.
Wow.
So both pieces will get cut, they'll get taped together, and they're within the same family, butternut and walnut, so they're compatible. And then the butternut will continue to grow using the root system of the black walnut.
Wow.
Yeah, but the really cool thing about scions and taking cuttings like that is, so if we can see in the background some of those really large walnuts that surround us,
Yes.
just say that's the example of the butternut that we would have collected the scion from. Just say those trees are 60 years old. After we graft it and plant it, if it came from a tree that large, it still thinks it's 60 years old.
Oh my goodness.
That's the genetic makeup of the tree. So even though it was only grafted in 2019 and it was planted in 2020, it genetically thinks it's much older.
That is wild. I love that.
Yeah.
Wow. So the grafting trees, the baby trees, let's call them.
Yeah.
Does putting them on the black walnut root, does cloning it, are you getting a lot of info from that? And is it telling you that the tree is doing just as well kind of as the wild tree that you got it from? Do you know that yet? Is that something you're trying to see?
And that is something we want to look at further because we do have lots of variability. So even though this tree was planted in 2019, you know, that still is what, 5 years ago. So it probably should be a little bit bigger at this point. So
it's actually 60, so.
Yeah, exactly right. It's got a long way to go. So there's a number of different things that can impact a tree's growth. So whether there was insect damage that kind of pushed it back, if we wouldn't have any deer damage here because I don't know if you noticed the entire thing is fenced, but it could be something specific with the genetics that it's just not doing too great. It could be this just one specific spot that it was planted on compared to a tree beside it that is doing pretty well. So there are a number of factors. So being able to compare the same clone on a different site will really help us get that insight into the quality of it.
I have a really hard time telling a butternut tree apart from other trees, especially walnut trees.
Yep.
I'm now you're making it harder because half of it is, well, not half of it, but can you tell us some identification tips for butternuts?
Absolutely. So with IDing butternuts, there's a couple different species that can easily be misidentified for butternut. Black walnut is an example of that, and occasionally bitternut hickory or some hickory species. So I'll run through a couple of quick ID features for butternut. Butternuts have a really large terminal bud right at the tip, kind of has a blunt edge. To me, it has kind of like a clay or a light gray color. The leaves themselves, right? So we have a compound leaflet. So all of this is an individual leaf. This is what would fall off in the fall or in the winter. The leaves themselves are kind of rough. The underside has a bit of a hairy characteristic to them. And then the actual leaflets themselves do not have a stalk off of that main stem there. So that's a couple indicators. If you're going to compare it to something like a walnut, especially at a distance, they can look really, really similar. In my hand here, I have a black walnut sample. And some of the main things that you can do to kind of look at the difference between walnut and butternut is this main terminal leaflet here. So with walnut, they're often shrunken or missing altogether, whereas with butternut you will always have that main terminal leaflet there. The bark, it's usually smooth and kind of a gray color when it's younger. As the tree matures, you have some variability. There will be kind of some spacing in the bark, so you'll have some variation in the color. So some of them are darker brown, but for me, when a butternut really stands out, it's a really clay colored. You kind of get some flat ridges on the edge of the butternut themselves. Very large trees, they will have really large crowns. They do like mostly open sun, but they will be found in forest communities, or if they're planted, they can be planted in lots of open areas or parklands. Well, unfortunately, another characteristic and an IDing feature for butternut is if you see something that has a canker. So a canker is a black, sooty, almost dark damage sort of on the tree, and that'll stand out all throughout the different parts of the stem. So you can have it at the base of the tree, all throughout. You can have it on branches, but that's another characteristic of a pure butternut. If you see a butternut that has some really good sealing around the wound, that's a good indication that it's potentially punitively tolerant. If all looks healthy and it's able to withstand some of those cankers, that's a good specimen of a butternut.
So Megan, obviously this is a very big project. How does this work help in terms of, obviously a very big question, but climate change?
The butternut archive in itself, it's a really great bank for the future genetics of the butternut trees, right? So we're able to have this kind of protected area that's managed of all these punitively tolerant, hopefully butternuts that can kind of share their genetics and produce seed for the future of the program. As far as climate change goes, at the FGCA with our climate change adaptation programs, all of it does kind of go back to that genetic quality, forest gene conservation. It goes back to our roots. We know that having a genetic diversity is the foundation of a resilient forest. And with climate change, that's becoming even more important.
Right.
So making sure that these individuals have a lot of different representation, there's a number of them together contributing genetics, that helps with things like the ability to adapt and survive with the changes that we're experiencing. It helps the species or the individual trees combat things like pests and diseases. So exactly what we're looking for with the butternuts with the canker, right? So if we have enough of them that are punitively tolerant, sharing genetics, hopefully that will continue to be passed on to the next generation. And then with genetic diversity, it also leads to things like increased forest products or things like growth and vigor, and then also just overall general ecosystem services. So with climate change, we do want to make sure that we're working with the best genetics possible, because that really is going to help our trees adapt. But we do know that with the predictions that we have and the projections, they are just that, they're projections. So we don't 100% know what our climate is going to look like later on. We don't know, how much more we'll continue to put into the atmosphere, how much we'll continue to potentially curb some of our emissions. So there really is a lot of things that are unknown. So with climate change, genetic diversity is a really important factor with that. We can also look at a trait-based approach for some species. So certain species are better able to withstand things like drought compared to other species that might be better able to withstand fire, or we look at how they might handle things like migration. So how can they reproduce? How is their seed spread? So those are all things that we look at with climate change. And then we also look at this individual trees or species' ability to cope with those stresses. So is it going to be particularly susceptible to drought? So will it die, right? Is it going to have some resistance to drought so it can kind of survive through a really heavy drought period? Or what is the tree's ability to recover after the stress? So those are all different things that we can look at for individual species, and they give us some really good tools as forest managers to make some decisions about, species. If we have a drought-prone area or if we have a flood-prone area, we can look at the species that are there and then make some management decisions about what's going to be the best move moving forward.
And just quickly, you mentioned ecosystem services. What do you mean by that in terms of trees?
Trees are part of the ecosystem. They're one part of it, right? We have trees, we have shrubs, we have ground vegetation, we have the wildlife that use the area, and then we have the whole water cycle that also interacts with the forest system. So when a forest is healthy, it's kind of functioning as it should, it supports that full ecosystem services. So we typically will have diversity, and that's diversity in species, that's diversity in age. So a lot of different moving pieces that are happening in a forest. When we have a resilient forest that's able to withstand stress like invasive species or climate change, it can continue to offer those services, water recharge areas, wildlife habitat. Where we have situations where trees are stressed due to climate change, so you could have lots of mortality, you could have a really big change in the composition of a forest because some species just aren't able to tolerate it. Same thing with invasive pests and diseases. With emerald ash borer is a really good example of that. We've had whole forest communities change because ash are lost. So really big changes can happen, and that definitely impacts the ecosystem.
So this is a very big project. You've set it up. The trees are planted, they're growing. Kind of what's the next steps? What happens now?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question, because the grafting and the scion collection and the planting, while a really big effort, is just the start. So there's a lot of work that goes into the maintenance and the long-term care, which is really important for these trees. We want these trees to be here long-term so that we can utilize their genetic material. Hopefully they'll produce seed. And we work with partners at the FGCA. So we, as an organization, we don't own land ourselves, so we rely on fantastic partners like Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, which is our partner on this site here. They're the folks that maintain it, take care of the trees, help us seed collection and all those kinds of things. So wouldn't be able to do it with Upper Thames without Upper Thames.
Yeah. Well, awesome. I know Rob has joined us today, so let's go chat with him.
Great.
Thanks for joining us today, Rob. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background and what you do for Upper Thames?
I'm Rob Davies. I'm the Forestry and Restoration Supervisor here at Upper Thames Conservation Authority. I've just been here close to 2 years. Prior to that, I worked with Essex Region Conservation Authority for about 16 years. The predominant role is just our tree planting and afforestation programs. So we're out on in the watershed planting trees for landowners and finding grants to help that work. But with FGCA, we're predominantly the boots on the ground, having eyes on what's happening in these archives, doing the maintenance of the mowing between the rows, keeping it nice and clean in the hopes of collecting a seed crop from these trees. This tree right here is actually one of few that produced a seed crop this year. So all these trees have a periodicity. So they won't produce a seed crop every year. And that's sort of a mechanism by trees to reduce the number of pests that might reduce the number of trees that grow into, seeds that grow into trees in the future. So by producing, every 3 to 4 years, they reduce those pests in the ground or predators that might eat these seeds. In terms of our maintenance, we come out, take a look for some of the pests and disease. We water some of the younger trees. We do the planting, so the grafts come to us usually at the end of May every year, and then we'll come out and plant them, mulch around each tree, and then we're really focusing on watering those trees. Early on, when these trees that think they are 50 start producing flowers and potentially seeds, we'll actually pinch those flowers off in the early spring to encourage them to put their efforts into the root system that will establish them on the landscape or in this archive. So these older ones, we let those flowers grow, and only a very few of these actually produce female flowers this year. And these are the ones that are producing seed. Last year, we collected over 1,000 seed from this archive, and then we shipped them up to partner nurseries, and they're growing those, putatively tolerant trees, so that we can hopefully start establishing them through our plantings and things throughout the watershed and other watersheds across Ontario.
Oh, very neat. How big is this site, like where the trees are?
This is a 5-acre site, so the majority of it has been designated towards butternut, but we did also have a small section where we planted some American chestnut as well.
Oh, okay. Very nice. Also another species that's kind of struggling, right?
Exactly, yeah.
This is quite the project, quite cool to see and to learn about what goes into possibly saving a tree species from the treacherous canker. And thank you to you and Megan for joining us today and telling us all about it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining me. Again, this tree, the butternut, is protected under the Ontario Endangered Species Act. So if you do ever come across it, you can report it on the Ontario Ministry of Environment and Conservation Parks website, or you can even just let the Forestry and Conservation Association know. And until next time, I'll see you in nature.